Hello, how's it going? Mm, 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 mm. Um, Today I'm going to do a video about um, an essay that I run a website. And on the website, I basically do a lot of notes, interpretation of essays, books, treatises, whatever texts from that are considered great books, great texts, classics. And in this series of books, um, is the main bit is called the Great Works of the Western World. There's also sort of a 10 book series that's sort of like a sister or second thought of this. It's called The Gateway to the Great Books. And in it, there's lots of short stories, there's lots of essays, there's lots of, just short, usually less than 20 pages, sometimes a little bit more. Never really on that. And some great essays need to be studied just as much as giant books like Don Quixote or something like that. And one of the pages that does really well on my website, well, relatively speaking, it doesn't do that well in the grand scheme of things. But for me, it actually is one of the most um, hit upon page. And it's an essay by a French critic whose name is Charles Augustin Sainte-Beuve, um, Charles Augustin Sainte-Beuve. I'll stick to the English pronunciation mostly because you sound like a pretentious, so and so if you just kind of insist on in getting, using that very strong French accent in something that's should be used in English in common parlance. Anyway, the essay is called "What is a Classic?" And ultimately, my whole hobby since I've started this website and started doing these videos is studying the classics. Maybe not necessarily in a purely academic sense, but understanding what makes uh, literature worth reading. Um, do they have good values? Do they have good morals? Is it entertaining? Um, do they say things that are true? Um, is it, not just in a sort of factual, does this check out kind of thing, but does it ring true? Does it resonate with the human experience if you're talking about literature? Um, and that's one of the reasons why somebody like Shakespeare is so great, because this guy fundamentally understood human nature in a way that just about no one ever did. And was able to put it in iambic pentameter, which is why it sounds kind of funny. But he's very poetic, and he very understands the human condition, and uh, really he wrote really good plots. I understand that most of them are actually kind of borrowed from other places, but he was able to turn them and make them his own. So anyway, the point is that the classic is something that it's pretty important to understand why something is called a classic. And Charles basically goes through and he says, well, what is a classic? He's like, well, it all depends on you. I mean, it really depends on your definition. So already, I've said in past videos that we need to talk about our definitions before we get there. And the question, the title itself is a question, what is a classic? And obviously he's sort of couching his terms. I wonder if he had any, economic training, because we're famous for being very ambivalent and equivocating a lot, mostly because we don't want to say anything that's wrong, yet there are many interpretations of a thing. So anyway, he starts off talking about the English, which is something that's interesting because I often find that the British and the French, um, as a whole, love to dump on each other. If you look at the more famous authors from both sides of the channel, they tend to really look at the other side with great admiration, even though they feel sort of uh, duty bound to dump on them whenever possible. But it's clear that people like Voltaire and Charles here were great uh, Anglophiles, and there are quite a lot of Francophiles in the annals of the of English literature. If they don't necessarily love everything about the French, they love their writing, they love their plays, they love their art. and the feeling is mutual. It's a very love-hate relationship. Having lived in both countries as an outsider, um, uh, it's very bizarre to see how much alike they are, yet how different they are. So anyway, he looks at them and he says, "Well, the English write essays about non-personal things." So if you look at something like a classic one of this is uh, Francis Bacon, who writes a lot about, like lots of essays, but he rarely talks about himself in them. And I've been doing a series of essays on, written by uh, Francis Bacon, and he talks a lot about different things that could be slightly sentimental, but he talks about them in a very abstract way, in a moral way, rather than this is something I felt. This is an experience that happened to me. While if you look at his counterpart in France, Michel de Montaigne, um, he does put himself and his own life and his own experiences more into the essay than an English author would. And the thing is that this is probably one of the main differences between the French and the English, is that the French seem to be much more concerned about your personal condition, while the British tend to be a little bit more withdrawn from the subject. And so anyway, he comes to the classic definition. So obviously he's been watching my videos and he knows that make your definitions known right up front and then we can start discussing. And he says, well, typically we would say in a sort of general sense what everybody would talk about is that this is usually an old text from an old author that has been given this sort of canonized status because of there's a widespread admiration for his writing, or the authority of his style of writing, and he just leaves it at that. I mean, I think he's just taking the room temperature and seeing what's going on. And he starts off, he said, well, that might not have always been the case, or maybe there's a root to that, is that the Romans actually started talking a lot about this. And they said, well, writers of worth and distinction are the ones who write classics. These are not like your sort of crap, low levels things. These are like for the high level things. And the Romans had always, especially culturally, had always looked to the Greeks in awe, especially in the early, throughout when they first had contact with each other in major ways. You see people like Polybius coming over to Rome, and he basically, if you were Greek in Rome, you were kind of, like a celebrity. And a lot of people, a lot of emperors would prefer to write in Greek just because they felt like it had a better poetry, a better sound to it than Latin did. And if you hear like Latin spoken or Greek spoken, I do think that Greek does have a little bit more of a romantic style, which is ironic, I think that Latin sounds much more like, perhaps this is just the influence of the church, it sounds much more like a prayer or a chant than Greek does. Greek does sound much more poetic, more song-like than the Latin does. And so after, in the early, like I would say like the late Republic, early Empire, people like Cicero and Virgil, who are and you study Latin, and I studied Latin for a number of years in high school and a little bit later, you study classic Latin, and then those are the two major prose and long-form poetry writers that you will study, are Cicero and Virgil. And these were the two first big names in the Latin language. And the Romans had always been sort of jealous, wanted some version of the old Greek writers in their own language. And so eventually all these famous playwrights like Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, Aristophanes started becoming replaced by Roman and Greek Roman authors in Latin. So you start seeing people like Ovid sort of supplanting Homer. You saw Boetius sort of putting up on the same level as Plato. And this continued on until, essentially that the classic world kind of fell apart. Christianity took over, and the focus became purely about religion, theology, religious texts, the lives of the saints. Everything that was written that's still looked at and still survives is basically about either history or theology. There's very little else. There's no entertainment, no nothing, unless you find these things entertaining, which can be in small doses, but it's largely it's when you think about who wrote back then. Writers were priests and monks, so they were obsessed with religion, they were obsessed with the Bible, and that's what they wrote about. And the rest of the people just couldn't read or write. And so they just kind of made up stories, sung songs, poems, and things like that, but they never got written down. And it wasn't until maybe what we would call the Renaissance, where you started seeing writers not only write things that weren't expressly religious, but were also written in the local language. So mind you that if we're talking about Latin, people, there would be some Latin written in England or in France, but most people didn't understand it. They would look at it and maybe figure a couple words. This one looks like 3, maybe. But ultimately, all this literature, even if it was not like expressly religious, it was lost on them because they didn't speak the language. And then you start seeing the Renaissance. You see the first guy, suddenly religion, boom, Dante. Now, Dante is a very religious text. It is entertaining, and there's a moral to it, and which is different because he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a monk. He was writing about religious matters, and he was heavily influenced by Saint Thomas Aquinas. But if you look at him, and you basically see, okay, there's a difference between Saint Thomas Aquinas, who's writing a very sort of dry text. It's interesting in small doses, but do not sit and read the Summa Theologica nonstop. You have to read it in bits, and it is very interesting. But I would say that Dante does read very well. And it was he was the sort of beginning of this. So he wrote in the very early 1300s. So you call him 14th century poet. And there's this sort of reintroduction of Latin and Greek works that were not expressly religious, not expressly Christian. You're going back, you would say rebirth, like that's what Renaissance means. Renaissance means birth. Means, again. So you start seeing, Dante writing in a language that people could read and at least hear. And you started seeing this sort of spread throughout all of Europe. You saw when Louis XIV came up, he had a ton of money and he was willing to spread it around, not just in architecture and fancy food and clothes and women. He was willing to be a patron of a lot of people. So, I have a list here as Perrault, Corneille, Molière, Pascal, who was kind of, I wouldn't call him directly patronized by Louis XIV, but he was sort of accepted as a mathematician as well as a philosopher. But you see Boileau, La Fontaine. La Fontaine wrote, it's funny that he doesn't make it that much over in the English world because we go back to Aesop's fables, and La Fontaine puts it into French poetry, and maybe a little tweaks on the story. But La Fontaine, for the French really don't know about Aesop like we do, and we don't know about La Fontaine, which is I always found interesting. People are like, oh yeah, it's a La Fontaine story. Like, no, that's an Aesop fable going back maybe 2,000 years before La Fontaine. So, then again, Shakespeare pinched all of his stories. So, who's the one to point the finger? And so, obviously, Sainte-Beuve is speaking from France, so he kind of focuses on the French-speaking world. Back then, almost exclusively France, maybe Switzerland, Belgium. The rest of the French-speaking world wasn't doing very much. And, obviously, we would, here in America or Britain, we would talk about English language poetry and literature. So you start seeing, like, after Louis XIV, you start seeing in the 17th century, or 18th century, 1700s, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Buffon, Rousseau, Now, these are not necessarily pure. Voltaire wrote both literature as well as prose, like literature as in sort of imaginative literature, like fiction and that. But he also wrote prose. Montesquieu wrote like political tracts. Rousseau wrote political and philosophical tracts. And so these are basically they're trying to branch out from the classic Roman and Greek setting into a new world, like a new sort of philosophy behind literature. And in the late 17th century, you get the Académie Française, which is basically a sort of an establishment of what literature is. This is a whole society devoted to what the French language is, what is a classic. They sit there around and talk about it. They still exist. They basically write the dictionary. And they came up with a definition of what a classical author is. I'm quoting here, a much approved ancient writer who is an authority as regards to the subject he treats. Now that's a very dry way of saying is that, yeah, he's a classic because we accept him as a classic. It's sort of tautological in that sense. But essentially they go back later and beyond that definition and they say, well, it's someone who gives precision to something, so some topic, giving models, examples, fixed rules for the composition of language. So they codify this, and once you codify it, it sort of becomes stagnant, and that's sort of the way the French language has stood for a while. Is that once you we in English, in the English-speaking world, we've never codified our language, so it evolves much more quickly because we don't have rules. We have rules, but we don't have like laws. That things are acceptable mostly because they sound right. And if you think about, there's tons of examples of how this has changed over the years, but largely that's the case. So Sainte-Beuve, basically, he comes up with his own definition. He's basically, and this is, I think, a little bit more realistic, is saying that he's an author who's sort of enriches the human mind, increases, and this is very French, which is very poetic, increases its treasure, advances it, discovers a moral, unequivocal truth, and reveals it in an eternal passion of the heart, making it broad, great, refined, sensible, sane, beautiful in itself, in its own style, without neologism, contemporary with those of all time. Now, the thing that I like about this is that it has its own style. So there's something original about his language, the author's language, the classic writer's language. And this is very flowery language, but he touches on something. It makes it contemporary with those of all time. And if you look at classics, like classic movies, classic music, why does something like the safety dance? I know this is sort of a bit of an out there example. Why do some songs from the 80s sound so 80s, and they sound dated? Within a year of their release, they just sound almost instantly old. They're of a time. Like disco is also like that. Some, even contemporary with disco or 80s, tend to have this sort of fresh take several decades after their release. Like Led Zeppelin has this. The Beatles have this. U2 has this. And slightly dated, but the music itself, I think, stands the test of time. And why is that? And it has this freshness to it. And this is, you read things like Shakespeare, it has this freshness where the story kind of just exists in this world that seems to last forever. It never seems dated. It never seems out of, just out of touch with reality or the current reality. And so the thing is that I think that the definition of what classic is revolutionary, but it's permanently revolutionary. And basically, it's this idea that will always stand and basically probably against reality because it's very abstract. Right? Obviously, reality is very, concrete. But you start looking at they seem to have this permanent revolutionary mindset to it. And you read any of the classics, they are still transgressive. Like I'm thinking of Macbeth. This is the one thing that keeps going over and over in my head. Is Macbeth is like it is revolutionary, but it also has morals. It has lessons in it. And so he goes through a few examples. He draws very heavily from French literature, Corneille, Moliere, and Sainte-Beuve. His definition, uh, he even finds it himself, is maybe perhaps a little too harsh, a little too strong. But there are conditions of wisdom, moderation, or reason um, that tend to leak out into the rest of the world. They influence other people to the point where you're like, this is a very influential. Sometimes we would use the word seminal, which means sort of uh, uh, seeds off, like it germinates, and it basically becomes uh, a tree from which the other classics are just the fruit of. Like um, you would say, like there was a classic quote by Isaac Newton. He says, if I see further than any man, it's because I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. That classics tend to be those giants. And other classics, subsequent classics, are giants standing on other giants' shoulders. Um, and so some of this, there's I would say that if you want to look at, you have to kind of compare these classics to sort of mid-level, kind of good, kind of they touch a bit on that definition, but they're never pure. The thing is that um, authors in that middle range, they tend to be very sensible, elegant, clear, noble. They tend to be strong writers. They tend to be have good sense, rationality. There is a turn of phrase, a soul, and then essentially that you have this virtue is basically he gets very poetic in this. Obviously, maybe he wants his essay to become a classic itself, where virtue is reason put into practice, talent is reason expressed through brilliance, soul is reason put forth delicately, genius is sublime reason. Now, some obviously, I think that um, um, he's going. It's a nice turn of phrase, but doesn't really stand up to things. I'm not really sure. So the thing is that you can say that classics um, have this definite. They could have this sort of imagination. But they're sort of subordinated to reason. But I would say that you know uh, he actually goes back and talks about the Aeneid and saying like I'm not really sure that every part of the Aeneid is falls under this definition of being very reasonable because there are sort of plot holes in the Aeneid. He talks about the fourth book. It's like, well, why did they do this? And if the whole story depends on the time where Aeneas and all of his Trojans are living with Dido, and then Dido, spoiler alert, but it's been 2,000 years, end up killing herself because Aeneas needs to leave Carthage. There are some plot holes, and if you read that, you think you're kind of left like, did it really need to happen like this? Are we? That's the thing about Aeneas, or like the Aeneid, is that it was written because it was custom ordered to Augustus, and so perhaps that Virgil kind of fudged a little bit. So the spirit, and he talks about this. He talks about spirit. So spirit is ruled by authors who rule inspiration. So you're taking the spirit of a classic is basically a writer using his inspiration rather than sort of just coming up with something else. So remember, inspiration means to breathe in. You were inspired. Somebody's breathing life into you. So obviously, the writer is some sort of conduit for some sort of magnificent work, and so it brings together a lot of the virtues all together in one thing. And obviously, he talks a lot about. I'm going to skip a lot of the um, the specific examples because you'd probably have to read a lot of like Monet, etc. But he does say like a lot of these classics like Montesquieu, uh, it's a little too wordy, a little too structured. Um, uh, Bossuet, I mean, he talks about this as an interesting one. Is basically it's a little too, it's not divided enough. Basically, he's kind of nitpicking over the structure of it. Sometimes that matters. I'm of the opinion if a book has, let's say it's like 400 pages. So if you want to divide that up into chapters, say you do 8 chapters, that's 50 pages a chapter. That's far too long. For me, I kind of roll my eyes. I'm like, all right, if this is really important, I'll bear through it. My ideal chapter length is somewhere between 10 and 20 pages. That way I don't feel like I have to continue reading. It encourages me to read all of the chapter without stopping, yet it makes me feel comfortable to stop at any point. Say if it's 10 pages and it's 400 pages, you have 40 chapters. It flows better, I think. If it's too short, like a book like Tristram Shandy, where the chapters are like 2 pages long, it's a little too short. It kind of works for Tristram Shandy, but I wish they were a little bit more fleshed out. So anyway, he talks about Goethe, and Goethe obviously wrote Faust. It's a 2-part play, but he wrote a few other things. But that's what he's mostly talks about. He talks about Goethe, who basically says like, well, a classic is healthy and romantic is sick. Now, the romantic period, you would say like probably a little bit after Goethe was writing. That classic seems to stand on its own. It doesn't seem overly sentimental. It has that delicate balance between passion and reason, while romantic is a little too heavy on the reason, or too heavy on the passion. And you just think, well, why are you doing this? Why are you thinking with your emotions or thinking with your nether regions? And perhaps Goethe sees, in his view, would maybe say that something like the Nibelungen, which is sort of a modern take on Germanic mythology, is just as much as a classic of Homer. Ancient works aren't necessarily classics because they're old, but because they have that healthiness to them. They do have that freshness and the power to them, and they stand the test of time. This is because every generation seems to agree with that. And so if we look at Homer being that sort of godlike figure in classic literature, it's not so much that an individual being this sort of preeminent figure, but it's more about like something that he's done is touching like the living expression of an epoch, where there's something about the Trojan War. If you read anything else written about the Trojan War, like Aeschylus wrote about it, Sophocles, Euripides, they tend to be very sort of goal oriented in their talk about it. I would say that Homer's a little bit like more bigger picture, rather than Aeschylus has a bone to pick. Euripides has a bone to pick. Euripides can be focuses on the little people that kind of get ignored. Somebody like Polyxena, or what's her name, or his name. It escapes me at the moment. Sorry. So anyway, like focusing on the smaller people, and the thing is that I think largely because it is entertainment, but it's also kind of he has a political point that he wants to prove, rather than kind of giving you the essence of the Trojan War. And so basically, you start seeing that the move away from Greek literature is not necessarily because we don't like the Greeks, or they kind of forgot about something, but we're interested in epochs, as Goethe would just say. We're interested in different times and what we can learn about the people and the spirit of the times through literature. So you can't just live in the Greek world. You have to sort of move on and study other times. And so if you look at Shakespeare, he talks quite a bit about Shakespeare and says that Shakespeare is a classic. He wasn't a classic of his own time. Alexander Pope was instantly a classic of his own time. But the thing is that Shakespeare kind of became a classic after his death, and after the publication of his first folio, which excludes a couple plays. But Shakespeare has taken on a life of his own long after his death. I mean, now he's like considered the greatest writer of all time. At the time, he was considered a very good writer. And so time has this sort of ennobling effect to writers like Shakespeare. And so if you look at that time, like a sort of like the time of Louis XIV or the time of Queen Anne in England, you'll see that these are classical eras. And largely because the king, the queen, is allowing this culture, this literature culture to develop. And when the political climate is very stifling, it's very, not just at the top down level from the king down or parliament down, but the world around you is a little too nervous. This is something that Thomas Hobbes wrote about. He basically said, the life of man and nature, I'm really butchering this, is nasty, brutish, and short. There's another one in there. But the thing is that the reason why that is because he's too worried about the danger around him from other people, that he has no time to focus on art and literature and sort of contemplation of life or God or whatever. If you're too worried about the physical world around you, like am I going to die today? Do I have enough food to eat? You're not going to be writing poetry. This is something that you might see in like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But those times of people like Louis XIV and Queen Anne, basically they were this sort of, there was an element of tolerance towards writers. Now, Louis XIV wasn't always tolerant, within bounds, obviously. Queen Anne was sort of seen as a caretaker, and there was too much worry about war with the Germans or war or sort of political intrigue that between factions within Parliament, that they didn't really focus too much on making sure that writers wrote the correct opinion. And you start seeing a flourishing, especially somebody like Jonathan Swift. But you do often, there's always an exception to this, that somebody like during the English Civil War, you saw people like Milton. Milton wrote in one of the worst times to write in English history. The 17th century, mid-17th century in England was a terrible time to be alive. You had the English Civil War. You had all this intrigue with Parliament. You had kings who were basically either killed, or you had basically not just censorship, but like you had to have a license to write a book, and if you didn't write the correct opinions, it never got published in the first place, let alone censored. And so Milton wrote in a very trying time, but he was able to write one of the best pieces of work in the English language, which is the Paradise Lost. But also you see people like Dante. Dante wrote during a civil war in Florence. And Shakespeare wrote during a very trying time in England. So you do see people like that perhaps, the really great writers wrote during trying times. Perhaps there's people who were a little bit timid or reluctant to write because of all the crap they're getting around them, that they just tend not to write at all. So it's sort of a bit of self-censorship. We might be seeing elements of that today. If you look at a lot of movies, they're not really pushing the envelope they're not making any radical statements anymore. They're just kind of poking needles at each other, or they're being reeled in because of censorship. I mean, this is a very trying political time in the Western world, at least in the Anglo world. And you're seeing a real dearth of classics right now. I don't see anything really worth watching, let alone watching twice, you know? Um, and, you know, the thing is that, you know, Sainte-Beuve is going to bring it back to France and French literature history. He says, like, there wasn't a lot of great stuff before Louis XIV. But then he goes and he contradicts that. He says Régnier or Rabelais, Montaigne were flukes. And it wasn't until people like Molière or La Fontaine did you actually see people churning out classics on, you know, just boom, boom, boom. And the thing is that if you look at Montaigne didn't really write his essays to be published. He sort of just kept for himself in the same way that Marcus Aurelius kept them. And ultimately, going back, he kind of reels it in. What makes a classic? And he says, I don't think there's any real recipe for making a classic. You just can't imitate classical qualities because ultimately they're not genuine. You're trying too hard. And you see this with music today. You know, you look at like some rock music. You say the Beatles wrote classics, and you have people who are trying to copy the Beatles, like Oasis. They wrote a couple of good songs. But they tried too hard to be the Beatles, and it never really caught on because it wasn't genuine. It wasn't pure. It wasn't moderated. It wasn't very accurate. It wasn't elegant. They tried too hard, and once in a while, Oasis hit gold a couple of times. It didn't hit it with any regularity because the goal wasn't to write something that was pure or really representative of the way you felt. It's about turning out hits. Even the Beatles was like, you know, they write a song and they'd write up, I'm writing a swimming pool right now. I heard that in an interview with Paul McCartney. That wasn't ultimately the goal. So I basically say like this, that I'll kind of wrap it up a little bit because I'm going a bit long here. But Sainte-Beuve basically says to himself that he wishes for design. So basically, I have trouble explaining this a little bit. So it's almost like he wants an echelon, like a higher echelon, this sort of medium one, lower one. You know, we would think about it sort of as maybe a pyramid. You have like the best of the best. He puts people like Shakespeare, and he puts Homer up there. And then a little bit lower than that, he goes down and he starts filling in the like people like Virgil and all this and Pope and all that because. And obviously, these are in different domains. So you have it in drama. And then if you want to go over to the domain of philosophy, you'd have somebody like Aristotle and Plato up there. Because they are timeless. Because they are widely read. Because they're not trying too hard. They actually just want to know what reality is and what to do on that, you know, basis, rather than trying to impress people, which you find with a lot of people that they try to impress you. Or they try to mimic, and that's not the goal. The goal is actually to get to the basis of human nature. And so you start seeing like a lot of people, you know, the reason why these things are called classics of like big classics is because they tend to focus purely on what they want to do rather than what they want to be seen as doing. Classically, that's something like from the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus, is that he said, you know, he said, look, don't try to be seen as praying. Don't try to be seen as giving to charity. Or don't try to be seen as fasting, being seen as noble and righteous. You should try to be those things. And if it's incidental that you are seen, then okay. You get good reputation. But you shouldn't be going for the reputation. You should be going for the good. And these are good things. Being seen as if you're doing it to be seen as you're doing it out of vanity, which is not good. That's bad, you know. So basically, he says Sainte-Beuve will say, look, let's not try to imitate the masters or be seen on the same level as them. But just know them, study them, admire them. Be sincere in what you wish to say. Be sincere in your own thoughts, your own feelings, and speak in your own voice about your time, not about the past. What is it that I can say that is fundamentally true and just honest about writing in my own time? And he says, perhaps if that's the case, nobody will write anymore. We'll just, we have enough to read. The libraries are full. Nobody ever printed another book. It wouldn't be the end of the world. We could still read and understand everything that was going on in the past. So classic, he kind of sums it up. He goes back and say, well, how can I redefine this? Is that a classic is an irresistible choice, shaped and definite, and something that we should want to know, want to experience because it's so honest. It's so telling. It's so gripping. It's so true. And there are plenty of classics. There doesn't need to be any more, but it's always better when there are more, right? Because you have more variety. There's these, as the publisher of these great books has said, that you have to look at the series of Western literature as authors having conversations with each other throughout time. They will reference one another. They will think about, that Dante did read people like St. Thomas Aquinas. He did read people like, Aeschylus and all that. And St. Thomas Aquinas did read Plato. He did read Aristotle. And you saw people like, Aeschylus. Aeschylus read Homer. They all know each other. If you're looking back into the past, Shakespeare knew these things. And, the great writers of the 18th, 19th century knew Shakespeare. And great writers of today know these people. And they're not trying to imitate them. They're looking at them and admiring them and studying. How is it that Shakespeare, what about his work is classic? It's because it's eternal. It is of the time, but there are some things about Shakespeare that are, Macbeth was written about a tyrant in the 11th century in Scotland, in a very remote region of Scotland. Okay, but there's something eternal. There's something timeless. There's something so much about the human experience, about ambition, about ambivalence, about taking the reins, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's about whether you're being goaded by your wife, whether you should listen to her or not, whether you should kill your friend if he gets in the way. These things. This is all from Macbeth. And then you start talking about King Lear. What do you do with an old man who's a little too old and silly to be king? Should you betray your own family to try to get his power? Things like that. These are, how many families are torn apart by money, or power, or influence, or how you are seen by the public, rather than being focused on what is a good family, and that's the tragedy of King Lear. But anyway, so these classics grow in stature. They don't diminish. The only thing that diminishes them is not being read. That's like, if you want classics to continue, you have to continue reading them. You have to continue talking about them. That's why I'm talking about them. You have to continue recommending them to friends. You have to start, what do you think about this? And if something comes up, you say, oh, that reminds me of King Lear. Or, what, that reminds me of Don Quixote. And you need to bring them back. And because they ultimately, you might not even be better off for having read them, or smarter or wiser, but you feel like, yeah, this is an intensely human feeling, and it's worth thinking about. And that goes back to the one of the first philosophers. The classic basically causes you to contemplate your life, and as Socrates says, the life unexamined is not worth living. So I'll wrap it up there. Maybe a shorter sort of personal video just to kind of get it out of my system. So I will see you later.